The youth pastor's replacement found a journal in the church basement. It documented 11 teenagers' spiritual crises. Mine was described as upcoming. Pastor Grayson called me into his office on a Friday afternoon holding a leather-bound journal he'd found while organizing storage boxes in the church basement. He'd only been at Cornerstone Fellowship for 3 weeks, hired after Pastor Derek Sullivan left suddenly for what the church board called an urgent mission opportunity in Central America. Grayson's face was pale when he asked me to sit down. He opened the journal to a page with my name at the top, Caleb Foster, written in blue ink with careful block letters. Below my name was a date circled in red next Saturday, with the words, "Crisis Intervention Scheduled," written underneath. Above my entry were 11 other names, each one crossed out with a black line and marked with dates spanning the past 4 years. I recognized every single name on that list. Vanessa Kirk died in a car accident 2 years ago when she drove off a bridge at 2 a.m. Michael Torres overdosed on pills 6 months after graduating high school. Beth Williams walked into Sterling Lake in January and didn't come out. All 11 were dead. All former members of Pastor Derek's youth leadership program, all teenagers who'd been part of Cornerstone Fellowship. All marked as crisis complete in Derek's handwriting. Pastor Grayson's hands were shaking as he turned the pages, showing me detailed entries for each of the 11 dead teenagers. The journal contained psychological profiles, notes about their families, documentation of their fears and vulnerabilities, and step-by-step plans for something Derek called spiritual breaking and rebuilding. Each entry followed the same format. First came observation notes where Derek recorded everything the teenager had shared during youth group or private counseling, their insecurities, family problems, traumatic experiences, anything that revealed emotional weakness. Then came the intervention plan, a detailed strategy for exploiting those vulnerabilities through isolation, shame, and manipulation disguised as spiritual guidance. Finally came the crisis documentation, Derek's notes on how the intervention had progressed and whether the teenager had achieved what he called complete surrender to divine will. Vanessa's entry noted she'd been struggling with abandonment issues after her parents divorced. Derek's plan involved convincing her that God was testing her faith by removing people from her life, then systematically encouraging her to distance herself from friends and remaining family until she was completely isolated and dependent only on him for spiritual direction. Michael's entry was even more disturbing. Derek had documented Michael's struggles with his identity and his guilt over thoughts he believed were sinful. The intervention plan involved intensive shame-based counseling sessions that framed Michael's internal conflicts as demonic possession requiring extreme spiritual warfare. Derek had scheduled daily meetings with Michael during the summer before his senior year, sessions that weren't recorded in any official church calendar or noted to Michael's parents. The notes described how Derek had convinced Michael that he was fighting a literal demon, and that the only path to salvation involved complete psychological destruction followed by spiritual reconstruction. The final entry about Michael was dated 3 days before his overdose. Derek had written that Michael had achieved breakthrough and was ready for final liberation. Beth Williams' entry focused on her depression and history of suicidal thoughts. Instead of recognizing these as symptoms requiring professional mental health intervention, Derek had called them openings for divine intervention through ultimate surrender. His plan involved encouraging her darkest thoughts while framing suicide as a potential pathway to heaven if done in the right spiritual state. I felt my hands go numb as Pastor Grayson turned to my entry. Derek had been documenting me for over a year, recording details I'd shared during youth group about my older brother's suicide 3 years ago. Noah had been 17 when he killed himself in our garage, and I'd been 14, too young to understand the signs, too wrapped up in my own life to notice he was drowning. I'd told the youth group about my guilt during a vulnerability night, how I carried the weight of wondering if I could have saved him if I'd just paid more attention. Derek's notes captured every word I'd said, along with observations about my behavior, my relationships, my spiritual state. His intervention plan was methodical and terrifying. Phase 1 involved building trust through increased private counseling sessions, positioning himself as the only person who truly understood my pain. Phase 2. involved isolating me from my parents by suggesting they couldn't handle discussions about Noah and that talking to them about my guilt would only hurt them further. Phase 3 involved intensive spiritual direction during a planned summer retreat at a remote cabin Derek owned, where he would conduct what he called final consecration. The circled date next to my name was the planned start of this retreat, 8 days away. Pastor Grayson said he was calling the police immediately because this journal documented what appeared to be systematic psychological abuse that had resulted in multiple deaths. He asked me directly if Pastor Derek had ever touched me inappropriately or made me uncomfortable physically. I told him no, nothing physical, but Derek had always made me feel exposed and vulnerable, like he could see into parts of me I wanted hidden. Derek had a way of asking questions that seemed caring, but left you feeling raw and defenseless. He'd encourage me to confide in him about my darkest thoughts, saying that pastors were like doctors, and everything shared in counseling was confidential between us and God. He'd recently told me he felt called to provide more intensive discipleship for me over the summer and had suggested the week-long retreat as an opportunity for deep spiritual work. My parents had been supportive, grateful that their withdrawn and grieving son had a spiritual mentor who seemed to care. They'd already approved the retreat, signed the permission forms, and paid the registration fee. I was supposed to leave next Saturday morning. The police arrived within 30 minutes of Pastor Grayson's call. Detective Isabel Flores was a woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She'd brought a younger partner, Officer Kevin Blake, who took photos of every page in Derek's journal while Flores questioned me and Pastor Grayson. She said she'd investigated 2 of the deaths mentioned in the journal, Michael Torres and Beth Williams, but both had been closed cases, ruled as accidental overdose and suicide respectively, with no evidence suggesting foul play or external manipulation. Now she was looking at documented proof that someone had systematically engineered their psychological destruction. She asked about my interactions with Derek, his counseling methods, the structure of the youth leadership program. I explained that Derek had been at Cornerstone Fellowship for 6 years, hired when I was 12 years old. The youth leadership program was selective, invitation only for teenagers Derek identified as having strong spiritual potential. He'd invited me to join when I was 15, shortly after Noah's death, telling my parents that mentoring grieving young people was part of his calling. Detective Flores asked if I knew where Pastor Derek had gone when he left Cornerstone. I told her what the church board had announced, that Derek had received an urgent calling to join a mission organization in Guatemala and had left immediately to serve communities in need. Flores made several phone calls from Pastor Grayson's office, while Officer Blake continued photographing the journal. After 20 minutes, Flores hung up and told us Derek wasn't in Guatemala and never had been. She'd contacted the mission organizations that worked in the region, and none had any record of Derek Sullivan. She'd also checked airline records through her department's connections and found no international flights under his name in the past month. Derek had lied about where he was going, which meant he was still in the country, possibly still working with vulnerable teenagers somewhere. Flores said she needed to track him down immediately, because if the pattern in the journal continued, he'd already be identifying and grooming new victims at whatever location he'd moved to. She asked if I had any contact information for Derek or knew anyone who might. I gave her his cell phone number and email, both of which I'd had since joining the youth program. Over the next 4 hours, while I sat with my parents in Pastor Grayson's office, Detective Flores coordinated with other law enforcement agencies to locate Derek Sullivan. My parents had arrived at the church within minutes of my calling them, my mother crying before she even reached the office, my father's face set in a mask of controlled rage. Pastor Grayson had explained everything, showing them the journal, my entry, Derek's plans for the retreat. My mother kept saying she'd almost sent me to that cabin. She'd been happy I had a mentor. She'd trusted him with her son's grief. My father wanted to know how this had happened under the church's supervision, how 11 teenagers had died without anyone connecting the pattern, how a predator had operated openly for years without being caught. Pastor Grayson had no good answers except that Derek had been careful, had positioned himself as a devoted spiritual leader, had never given obvious warning signs that church leadership had recognized. The deaths had occurred over 4 years at irregular intervals, some while the teenagers were still active in the church, others after they'd graduated and moved away. Without Derek's journal documenting his intentions, Each death looked like an isolated tragedy. Detective Flores returned to the office at 8 p.m. with significant news. She'd tracked Derek Sullivan to a church in Oklahoma, 400 miles away, where he'd been hired 5 weeks ago as their new youth pastor under a slightly different name. Derek Sutton instead of Derek Sullivan, close enough that anyone checking references would find him, but different enough to potentially avoid certain background checks. Flores had contacted the police department in that jurisdiction, and they'd sent officers to Derek's address immediately. They'd arrested him at his apartment and had seized multiple journals identical to the one Pastor Grayson had found. Derek had been documenting 8 teenagers at his new church, with 5 names already crossed out and 3 marked as in progress. Flores said local authorities were investigating those 5 deaths now, trying to determine if they could be connected to Derek's arrival in the area. She said Derek had been doing this for longer than just his time at Cornerstone, that there were journals dating back 8 years covering multiple churches in different states. The scope was bigger than anyone had imagined. The next morning, I woke up to news coverage about Derek's arrest. The story had broken overnight, and reporters were calling it one of the most disturbing cases of religious abuse in recent memory. A youth pastor who'd systematically identified vulnerable teenagers, gained their trust, and then used sophisticated psychological manipulation to drive them to suicide while documenting the process as spiritual intervention. The media had gotten hold of details about the journals, though not the names of the victims yet. My phone was filled with messages from friends at church asking if I was okay, if it was true that Derek had targeted me, if I'd known about the others. I didn't respond to most of them because I didn't know what to say. I kept thinking about all the times I'd sat in Derek's office talking about Noah, how Derek had listened with such apparent compassion, how he'd made me feel like my grief mattered and my guilt was valid, and working through it with him was the path to healing. All of that had been calculated manipulation, building the foundation for whatever crisis intervention he'd planned for next week's retreat. Detective Flores came to our house that afternoon with more information. The police in Oklahoma had executed search warrants on Derek's apartment and storage unit, finding extensive documentation of his methods going back to his seminary training. Derek had written what amounted to a dissertation on induced spiritual crisis as a form of radical religious conversion, a paper he'd submitted to his seminary professors that had been rejected as psychologically dangerous and ethically untenable. Rather than accepting that judgment, Derek had spent the next decade refining his methods and applying them to real teenagers in churches that trusted him. The journals showed a clear pattern. He'd target teenagers who were already vulnerable due to trauma, family problems, mental health struggles, or identity questions. He'd position himself as their sole source of spiritual guidance, isolating them from other support systems, including family, friends, and professional counselors. He'd use intensive one-on-one sessions to break down their psychological defenses, exploiting their specific vulnerabilities through shame, fear, and religious manipulation. Finally, he'd engineer a crisis point where the teenager felt completely hopeless and viewed death as either divine punishment they deserved or spiritual liberation they should seek. The journals included Derek's theoretical justifications for his methods. He'd convinced himself he was performing a service, that teenagers needed to experience complete psychological destruction before they could achieve authentic faith. He'd written about how modern Christianity was too soft, too therapeutic, too focused on making people feel good rather than confronting the darkness in their souls. He believed that true spiritual rebirth required death, literal or metaphorical, and that guiding teenagers to that point was an act of radical love. The crossed-out names in his journals weren't failures to him, they were successes, teenagers who'd achieved the ultimate surrender to God's will. The ones who survived his crisis interventions and didn't die were considered incomplete transformations, and Derek would often revisit them later for additional sessions. Detective Flores said psychologists who'd reviewed Derek's writings described him as having a messianic complex combined with sociopathic tendencies. He genuinely believed he was helping these teenagers while systematically destroying them. Over the next week, families of the deceased teenagers were notified about the investigation. Parents who'd spent years blaming themselves for missing warning signs, who'd been told their children's deaths were unexplainable tragedies, now learned that someone had deliberately engineered those outcomes. The response was devastating and varied. Some families wanted Derek prosecuted to the fullest extent, demanding he face consequences for every life he'd taken. Others struggled to accept that their children's deaths weren't random, that they'd been targeted and manipulated, that the youth pastor they'd trusted had been a predator. Several families contacted lawyers to discuss civil suits against Derek and the churches that had employed him. Detective Flores coordinated with victim advocates to provide support services and counseling resources. I attended a meeting where families of Cornerstone victims gathered to share information and support each other. Vanessa Kirk's parents looked 10 years older than I remembered. Michael Torres's mother couldn't stop crying. Beth Williams' father sat in silence, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. At that meeting, I met Ethan Clark, an older brother of one of the Oklahoma victims. His sister Melissa had been 15 when she died 8 months ago, found hanged in her bedroom closet with a suicide note that quoted scripture about surrendering earthly struggles. Ethan had never believed his sister would kill herself. She'd been anxious and stressed about school, but not suicidal, not in the way the note suggested. When police arrested Derek and found journals documenting Melissa's spiritual crisis intervention, Ethan finally had confirmation that his instincts had been correct. He'd driven 8 hours from Oklahoma to attend this meeting because he wanted to meet other families, to understand the full scope of what Derek had done. Ethan told us that police in Oklahoma had identified 8 churches where Derek had worked over the past decade, 3 of them before he came to Cornerstone. Investigators were reaching out to those churches to identify potential victims and cross-reference deaths with Derek's employment timeline. The number of teenagers Derek may have manipulated was growing, potentially dozens across multiple states. The district attorney assigned to Derek's case was a man named Lawrence Graham, who specialized in complex criminal prosecutions. He met with me and my parents to explain the legal challenges ahead. Proving that Derek had caused the deaths would be difficult because he'd never physically harmed anyone. His weapon had been psychological manipulation conducted through private counseling sessions that left no witnesses. The journals provided evidence of intent and methodology, but defense attorneys would argue that Derek's writings represented his personal spiritual theories, not proof of criminal action. They'd claim the deaths were tragic coincidences, that troubled teenagers sometimes died by suicide regardless of counseling they received, and that correlation wasn't causation. Graham said the strongest charges they could pursue were child abuse, practicing unlicensed therapy, and potentially manslaughter if they could prove Derek's actions directly caused specific deaths. He needed testimony from survivors, people who'd been through Derek's crisis interventions and could describe what happened in those private sessions, people who could explain how Derek's manipulation worked. I volunteered to testify about my experiences with Derek, even though my crisis intervention had never been completed. Graham said my testimony would be valuable because Derek's journal entry about me documented his plans before execution, providing a roadmap of intent that could help jurors understand what he'd done to the others. But Graham also wanted to talk to anyone who'd survived Derek's complete crisis intervention process, people who'd been through the retreat or intensive counseling, but hadn't died. Pastor Grayson helped identify 4 former youth group members who fit that category, people who'd been in Derek's program, had gone through periods of crisis, and had somehow survived. I contacted one of them, a 21-year-old woman named Angela Foster, who'd been in the youth program 3 years before me. She agreed to meet at a coffee shop to talk about her experiences with Derek. Angela looked nervous when she arrived, like she'd been dreading this conversation but knew it was necessary. She said she'd tried to forget everything about her time in Derek's program, but seeing the news about his arrest had brought it all back. Angela described undergoing Derek's crisis intervention during the summer between her junior and senior years. Derek had convinced her that she needed intensive spiritual counseling to overcome guilt about a past relationship. He'd scheduled daily meetings at the church where he'd spent hours questioning her about her thoughts, her feelings, her worthiness of God's love. He'd told her she was carrying demonic influence that needed to be expelled through complete psychological surrender. The sessions had involved prayer, confession, and what Derek called spiritual warfare techniques that were actually sophisticated emotional manipulation. He'd made her write down every sin she could remember, read the list aloud repeatedly until she was sobbing, then burn the list while he prayed over her. He'd restricted her food intake during the week-long intensive process, saying fasting enhanced spiritual receptivity. By the end, Angela had been dissociated, exhausted, and in a state of total dependence on Derek for direction. She'd believed she was spiritually broken beyond repair, and that only Derek's continued guidance could save her. The only reason she'd survived, she said, was that her parents had noticed the drastic changes in her behavior and had pulled her out of the program against Derek's strong objections. Even then, it had taken 2 years of actual therapy to undo the psychological damage. Detective Flores arranged for Angela and the 3 other survivors to give formal statements. Their testimonies provided crucial details about Derek's methods that corroborated the journal entries. They described the isolation tactics, the shame-based manipulation, the way Derek positioned himself as their only source of spiritual truth, the extreme measures he'd used to break down their psychological defenses. One survivor, a young man named Christopher Ward, described being taken to Derek's cabin for a weekend retreat, where Derek had confiscated his phone, kept him awake for 36 hours through continuous prayer and counseling sessions, and had convinced him that his depression was actually demon possession that required exorcism. Christopher said the experience had been so traumatic that he'd left Christianity entirely afterward and still had nightmares about being trapped in that cabin. His testimony was particularly powerful because his planned retreat had been at the same location Derek had intended to take me the following week. Police obtained a warrant to search Derek's cabin and found a basement room set up for prolonged psychological manipulation, with religious materials, recording equipment, and a notebook detailing session structures for crisis intervention. The legal process moved forward over the next 6 months, while Derek remained in custody without bail. He'd been charged with 19 counts of child abuse across multiple jurisdictions, 8 counts of manslaughter, practicing therapy without a license, fraud, and numerous other related offenses. His defense team tried multiple strategies to get charges reduced or dismissed. They argued that religious counseling was protected free speech and that Derek's methods, while unconventional, fell within the bounds of pastoral care. They claimed the deaths were unrelated to Derek's counseling because several occurred months or even years after teenagers had left his program. They presented expert witnesses who testified about the high baseline suicide rate among troubled adolescents and argued that Derek couldn't be held responsible for outcomes he hadn't directly caused. But the prosecution had Derek's own journals, his documented intentions, survivor testimony about his abusive methods, and a clear pattern of deaths connected to his crisis interventions. The evidence was overwhelming, even if the legal theories were complicated. I attended much of the trial, sitting with other victims' families in the courtroom gallery. Derek looked smaller in person than I remembered, dressed in a plain suit rather than his usual expensive clothes, his confident pastoral demeanor replaced by a calculating wariness. He never made eye contact with any of us. His attorney called Derek to testify in his own defense, a risky strategy that backfired dramatically. Derek maintained that he'd been trying to help troubled teenagers through intensive spiritual guidance, that his journals reflected his sincere attempts to document his pastoral work, and that the deaths were tragic outcomes he'd never intended. But under cross-examination, prosecutor Graham walked Derek through specific journal entries where he'd written about engineering psychological crises and achieving breakthrough through complete surrender. Graham asked Derek to explain what he'd meant by final liberation and divine will through ultimate sacrifice. Derek's answers became increasingly convoluted as he tried to maintain that his language had been metaphorical spiritual expression, not literal intentions. When Graham asked Derek why he'd fled to Oklahoma under a different name and immediately started documenting new teenagers in crisis intervention plans, Derek had no good answer. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from Derek's former seminary professors who'd reviewed his controversial thesis on induced spiritual crisis. They testified that they'd warned Derek his theories were psychologically dangerous and ethically unacceptable, that they'd specifically told him never to implement those ideas with actual counseling subjects. One professor said he'd considered reporting Derek to seminary administration, but had assumed Derek would abandon the theories after graduation. That professor testified with visible guilt, saying he'd second-guessed that decision every day since learning what Derek had done. The seminary's current president testified that if Derek had tried to submit that thesis today, the school would have required psychiatric evaluation before allowing him to continue in ministry training. Expert witnesses in psychology and counseling testified about the tactics Derek had used, explaining how isolation, shame manipulation, sleep deprivation, and exploitation of trauma create conditions for psychological breakdown. They described Derek's methods as systematic abuse disguised as spiritual care, noting that his techniques were similar to those used by cults and other high-control groups. Family members of the deceased teenagers gave impact statements during the sentencing phase. I sat through 3 days of parents describing their children, the warning signs they'd missed because they'd trusted Derek, the years of grief and guilt they'd carried. Vanessa Kirk's mother described finding her daughter's car at the bottom of that ravine, how she'd died alone, thinking God wanted her isolated from everyone who loved her. Michael Torres's father read entries from Michael's journal where his son had written about feeling possessed by demons and unworthy of life, language that clearly echoed Derek's manipulation. Beth Williams' younger brother, only 12 years old, read a letter describing how his sister's death had destroyed their family and how he'd grown up believing he'd somehow failed to save her. Christopher Ward testified about his ongoing trauma from the cabin retreat and his continued struggle with religious triggers. Angela Foster described spending 2 years in therapy undoing the psychological damage Derek had inflicted in 1 week. When it was my turn to speak, I talked about my brother Noah, about how Derek had been his youth pastor too, about how I'd never know what really happened in Noah's counseling sessions 3 years ago, but I had to live with the possibility that Derek had engineered my brother's death before moving on to target me. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, they'd found Derek guilty on 16 counts of child abuse, 5 counts of manslaughter, and multiple lesser charges. They'd acquitted him on 3 manslaughter counts, where the connection between his actions and the deaths couldn't be proven beyond reasonable doubt, but the convictions they did deliver carried significant weight. The judge sentenced Derek to 35 years in prison without possibility of parole for the first 20 years. During sentencing, the judge said Derek had betrayed the most fundamental trust that exists in religious communities, the trust vulnerable people place in spiritual leaders. The judge said Derek had weaponized faith, turning something meant to provide comfort and guidance into a tool for psychological destruction. The judge said Derek's education, his position, his documented awareness that his methods were dangerous made his crimes even more egregious because he'd known better and had done it anyway. Derek was led from the courtroom in handcuffs while families of his victims watched. Some people cried with relief. Others sat in stunned silence. No verdict could bring back the teenagers who died, but at least the person responsible was being held accountable. The institutional fallout continued for years after Derek's conviction. Cornerstone Fellowship underwent complete leadership restructuring. The church board that had hired Derek and failed to catch his predatory behavior all resigned under pressure from the congregation. Pastor Grayson stayed on, but implemented comprehensive new safeguarding policies, including mandatory background checks, training on recognizing abuse, limits on one-on-one counseling with minors, and external oversight of youth programs. Other churches where Derek had worked faced similar reckonings. Several faced civil lawsuits from victims' families alleging negligent supervision and failure to protect children in their care. Some of those cases settled for significant sums. Others went to trial and resulted in findings that institutional negligence had enabled Derek's abuse. The denominational organization Derek belonged to revised their credentialing process to include psychological evaluation and created new mandatory reporting requirements for concerning behavior. These changes came too late for the teenagers Derek had killed, but they might prevent future predators from operating as freely as he had. I graduated high school and went to college to study psychology, wanting to understand how people like Derek operated and how systems failed to protect vulnerable individuals. I stayed in contact with some of the other survivors and family members, people connected by shared trauma who understood each other in ways others couldn't. Angela Foster became an advocate for religious abuse survivors, speaking publicly about her experiences and working with organizations that provided support services. Christopher Ward sued his former church and used the settlement money to fund a nonprofit focused on cult deprogramming and recovery. Ethan Clark wrote a book about his sister Melissa's story and the systematic failures that had allowed Derek to prey on teenagers across multiple states. These efforts wouldn't resurrect the dead or erase the trauma the living carried, but they represented attempts to transform pain into purpose, to ensure that something meaningful came from such senseless destruction. 5 years after Derek's conviction, I visited the memorial garden that Cornerstone Fellowship had installed on their grounds. 11 stones with 11 names, teenagers who'd trusted their church and had been betrayed by someone meant to protect them. I read each name aloud and told them their deaths weren't in vain, that the person responsible was in prison, that systems were changing because of what happened to them. Then I added flowers to Noah's stone, placed there at my request because I'd never stopped wondering if Derek's manipulation had played a role in my brother's death 3 years before I ever joined that youth program. I'd never know for certain what was said in those private counseling sessions, but the possibility that Derek had groomed my brother first and then targeted me later would stay with me forever. Justice had been served in legal terms, but some wounds never fully heal, some questions never get answered, and some losses can never be restored. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.